It's good to have your company. Welcome to the News Hour. Moscow has accused the US government of fighting an indirect war against Russia using Ukrainian soldiers instead of its own. The comment follows a visit to Washington, D.C. by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, his first overseas trip since Russian troops invaded nearly a year ago. In an address to Congress, Zelenskyy said the supply of military aid for Kyiv was an investment in global security and democracy. The eastern city of Bakhmut is now the epicentre of the war. Ukrainian forces have held their ground in a territory Russia could use to advance on other cities if it takes control. Well, Salam Khodr is standing by for us in Moscow, but first let's hear what Charles Stratford has to say from the capital, Kyiv.
Bakhmut is undeniably one of the hottest places along that 1,300-kilometre front line. It's a city that has been fought for with increasing intensity, I suppose, over the last sort of 5 months of this 10-month war. And it's fair to say that certainly in the last month or so, the Russians have made very little advance. We know that the fighting is especially intense in the east of the city. This is a place that has now been called a meat grinder, and that's with reference to that World War I battle of Verdun, where tens of thousands of soldiers were killed. We understand that thousands of Ukrainians and Russian soldiers have been killed in the battle for Bakhmut, many civilians as well. We also know that there are still, surprisingly, quite a few civilians in that town refusing to leave, largely, as is usually the case, because they have nowhere else to go and they're worried about their properties. Bakhmut is strategically important because it is potentially a gateway to other large cities in the Donetsk region, the cities of Krematorsk and Slavyansk. But it's fair to say that the situation has come to a very brutal war of attrition and a stalemate.
Well, let's cross over to Moscow now and speak with Al Jazeera's correspondent Salam Khodr. Before we talk about reaction to Zelenskyy's visit to the US, let's just talk about the IAEA chief. He's been in Russia, again, trying to avoid any potential sort of nuclear incident. I mean, what's come out of that meeting and that visit?
Sohail Grossi has arrived this morning to Moscow, and he had a very long meeting, if we may say so, with the head of the Russian Atomic Agency. In the meeting, there were representatives also of the Ministry of Defense, the Russian Ministry of Defense, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and also a representative from the National Guards, the Russian National Guards, who are the main troops that are now present in Zaporozhye nuclear plant. After the meeting, nothing official was announced, just Rafael Grossi tweeted saying that it's very important to establish a security zone along Zaporozhye nuclear plant in order to avoid a nuclear incident. Also, the head of the Russian nuclear agency, Alexei Lekhatchov, has said that a rapprochement has been observed during the meeting between the two parties on a possible draft of establishing a security zone in Zaporozhye. But Lekhatchov has added, saying that now more consultations will go on with the IAEA in order to draft a mutually accepted proposal on that zone. Just to remind you, Sohail, and everyone else, that Russia continuously is saying that it has no problem establishing this zone along Zaporozhye, with one very important condition, which is that the soldiers, the Russian soldiers, especially from the National Guard, shall remain in Zaporozhye. Zaporozhye is one of 4 Ukrainian regions that Moscow has annexed last October after a very disputable referendum, Sohail.
Indeed, and of course, many moving parts to the story today for Ukraine. Let's talk about reaction from Russia in terms of that very warm welcome that Zelenskyy got in Washington, D.C., and a promise of more arms and more funding. That's going to anger Moscow.
It has indeed, Sohail. We've heard today from the spokesman of the Kremlin, Mr. Dmitry Peskov. He said that the visit in itself shows that neither Kiev nor DC are willing to sit and talk about the conflict in Ukraine. Also, Peskov said that all the arms, especially the Patriot systems that the United States has promised to provide Kiev with, will be a legitimate target to the Russian army. Also, all the trainers, the military trainers, all operators, if they have been sent and deployed in Ukraine, the Westerns and the Americans will also be a legitimate target to the Russian army. This is what Peskov had said. Also, he added that these continuous shipments of arms will only prolong the agony of the Ukrainian people, and it will not hinder Moscow to achieve the goals of what Moscow calls the special operation in Ukraine, which is the war there, Sohail.
Salam Khodwa for the update. Thanks very much, our correspondent there for us in Moscow.